Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, also representing OES Environmental. And this is the workshop on collision risk to marine mammals from tidal turbines, next steps towards understanding and retiring risks. And this is brought to you by OES Environmental, also ORGEP. And you see the list of some of the participants and presenters there: Lisel Garavelli and Lene Hemery, as well as me from PNNL, Jen Fox and Rayanne Miller from Aquaterra. And our featured speaker today is Carol Sparling from the University of St. Andrews. But today we are going to talk about the goals of the workshop, do an introduction, which will be done by Lisel Garavelli, on collision risk and encounter risk models. Just a very simple presentation on what the models are, what they do. So we're just all on the same page with definitions and so on. Carol Sparling will do a background presentation on what we know about marine mammals and collision and encounter with turbines. You'll get some instructions and goals for the first breakout session, and then you'll be taken into a breakout session. Following that, there'll be a report out and then a quick break. We'll have a short presentation following that first breakout, which is sort of a case study. How have some of these collision risk models been used in a real tidal project? Then our second breakout session, which will focus a little more on models and a report out. We'll end with some open discussion and a wrap up. So we have a busy 3 hours ahead of us. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Go ahead, Debbie. So just very quickly, your hosts here today, OES Environmental. This is an initiative under the International Energy Agency's Ocean Energy Systems. OES has 25 countries participating. And this particular initiative, 16 of those countries participate in OES Environmental, which is looking at environmental effects of marine energy development with an eye towards how can we learn enough to make consenting or permitting go smoothly. And our activities are coordinated and everything is recorded on Tethys. If you don't know Tethys, it's our online knowledge management system. The URL is there and you'll find a wealth of information about environmental effects. And the booklet pictured on the right is our last large release. It is the 2020 State of the Science Report, almost 300 pages of information on environmental effects. Next slide, please. Jen.
Thanks, Andrea. A lot of you will be familiar with ORGEP Ocean Energy, the Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Programme for Ocean Energy. So this is the programme that we at Aquaterra run the Secretariat for. It's a UK-funded programme, and the overall aim is to reduce the consenting risks for wave, tidal stream and tidal range projects. And a lot of what we do aligns itself really, really nicely with the work that Andrea and her team does through OES Environmental. Essentially, how we get towards that aim is by facilitating a strategic, coordinated and prioritized approach to monitoring and research that is endorsed by industry, regulators and statutory nature conservation bodies. So hopefully some of you will be quite familiar with some of our key outputs over the years, one of which is the Forward Look document, and another one that just came out late last year is the Critical Evidence Gaps of Wave and Tidal Energy report. Those are both available on the ORGEP Ocean Energy website, and we do also have a wide international network of folks who are interested in the work that we're doing and being involved and hearing more from us. So you're very welcome to join us if you haven't already by just dropping us an email at orgep@aquaterra.co.uk. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, Jen. Next slide. Okay, so what are we doing here today? We're really trying to focus on how we collect information that can move towards collision risk and counter risk, whatever models we think are appropriate to understand what is happening between marine mammals and turbines, particularly in the consenting or permitting realm. So what we want to do is we want to highlight the knowledge and also the data gaps that limit our understanding of these interactions. We want to identify methods for collecting those data that will fill the gaps. I do want to note we are not talking today about instrumentation, what particular configuration of instruments needs to be used to collect them, but on a more generic level, what kind of data need to be collected. We want to determine the suitability of the existing models for collision risk and also how they may affect populations. And we want to identify the data that are really needed for parameterizing and also validating these models. How do we make them better? How do we create new models, etc.? You're all here today because you have a stake in this. You've got expertise in one aspect or another of this. We have the researchers. We also have a significant number of regulators and advisors, which I think is really helpful to understand what is really needed to move forward with consenting. Okay, next slide, please. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lisel Garavelli, who's going to talk to us about collision risk models. Lisel.
Thanks, Sandra. Hi, everyone, and apologies again for the one who already listened to that, but promise it's quick. So we wanted to introduce a bit the collision risk model. Next slide, please, Debbie. And with that, we wanted to start with some definition of some behavior that are included in the model, such as the avoidance, which is when an animal is responding to and moving away from a device at great distances, or the evasion, which is when an animal is changing their behavior to escape a contact with a device at close distance, so after the encounter, but averting the collision. Other definition are, well, the encounter, which is when an animal is being in the near field of a turbine, which is between 1 and 5 devices length. The collision, which is when an animal is being in contact with the blade of a turbine. And I'm going to talk about also the exposure time, which is the amount of time the animal spends at the depth and in the field of a device. Next. So what do we use collision risk model for? The purpose of collision risk model, the first one is to estimate the likelihood of an encounter between an animal and a device. And there is also models which are used to estimate the likelihood of contact, so the collision between an animal and a device. The rates of this encounter and collision depend on the size and location of a device, the animal behavior, the animal ability to detect the device, and the animal behavior in response to the device. And the outcome of the model are the probability of encounter or collision. And if we have some data on if the animal survived after the collision, we can also know, depending on the model we are using, what would be the effect on the population. Next, thank you. So I'm going to present 3 types of model today, and the first 2 are used to estimate this interaction between the animal and devices. And the first model is called the encounter rate model, which estimates the likelihood of being in the near field of the turbine. And the second one, the collision risk model, which estimates the probability of contact between the animal and the turbine. And there is a model in the literature which is used to estimate the potential effect of a collision to the population. So this is called the exposure time population model, and it associates the collision risk to population effects by estimating the rates of fatal collision that lead to a specified detrimental effect on the population. Next. So I'm going to start with very quickly to describe each model. So the first one, the encounter rate model, it's actually a predator-prey model that integrates the volume of water swept by a predator. Here, the predator is the blade of the turbine. It integrates the size of the prey density, and the relative swimming speeds of the predator and the prey, which is the blade and the animal. So in this model, the turbine blade is viewed from the side, and it sweeps a certain volume of water in a unit of time that an animal has some probability of occupying. So this model estimates the likelihood of encounter between prey and predator, but with the important thing here, it assumes no behavioral response of the animal to the turbine. And it's best suited for horizontal axis turbine. Next. The collision risk model, which there are actually two models here. The first one is a numerical model, and it's based on band study, which was developed for birds and offshore wind farm. And this model integrates the area covered by the rotor, the size of the animal's transit time across the plane of the rotor, and the animal's behavior and density. So this model estimates the probability of collision between the animal and the turbine. It is sensitive to assumption about avoidance rate, and it's also best suited for horizontal axis turbines. There are actually few studies that include the avoidance or evasion behavior. One, Amar et al. In 2015 that based this behavior on the behavioral observation of fish, so from field study. And the other one, Coping and Greer in 2018, which includes injury risk based on the part of the animal's body that contacts the rotor. Next. The second collision risk model, it's a spatial simulation, and it represents the animal and the device over time in 3 dimensions. This model integrates the shape and movement of one device, the animal's behavior, the animal's size, and it estimates the probability, again, of collision between the animal and the device. And the variation, it's important here to know that the variation in input parameter influences the collision probability. So we are able in this type of model to put some behavior such as the vertical migration, this one is the case of fish, but for marine mammal, there is actually other behavior we can incorporate. The model integrates it's used to integrate the relative complexity of a tidal kite. So it's useful to look at potential effect of tidal kite, and it can also be used to include the interaction with flow. Thank you. And finally, the exposure time population model, which was developed for diving birds. It approaches this one collision risk from the perspective of the population. So it kind of works backward. So the model integrates the population, two models, sorry. The first one is the population model, which estimates the amount of additional mortality caused by collisions that would not decrease the population growth rate. And the exposure time model that estimates the collision probability from the amount of time the animal spends at the depths of the device and the proportion of that depth occupied by the device. So this model estimates the collision risk per unit of time based on the population size and individual exposure time, and it provides a threshold mortality rate. It assumes that every collision is fatal and does not include avoidance or evasion behavior. Next. So overall, for marine mammals, the inputs required in a collision risk model are population density, the angle of approach towards the device, swimming speed, the body size of the animal, which is length or width, diving behavior, such as the frequency of dive, the depth, the proportion of time foraging, and in the case of exposure time population model, we could incorporate the reproduction or survival of the population. And to finish, the next slide, please. So just to conclude on this model, they are used, as I said, 1,000 times to estimate probability of encountering collision, or if you have, or to actually evaluate a mortality threshold that would affect a population. The behavior in this model can have large effects on the outcome, which creates uncertainties when using behavior with limited information. The injury outcomes, death, and population effects are usually not considered in these models. And the outputs are mainly predictive for one single turbine. So there are not studies about arrays for marine mammal, as far as I know, and please let us know if there is one. So the empirical parameterization of behavior and density in model is rare, and there is actually no existing validation of predicted collision probability. Thank you very much. And let us know if you have any question. Andrea.
Thanks very much, Lisel. So that was a very quick romp through the models. Any quick questions for Lisel? We'll have a chance to discuss some of these, of course, in the breakout groups. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. We're very pleased to have Dr. Carol Sparling here from University of St. Andrews, who is going to talk about the work that she and her colleagues have been doing for some period of time on marine mammals and collision risk. So, Carol, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, so thanks to OES and ORGIP for inviting me to speak today. And thanks, Lisa, for an excellent overview of the models and the parameters that go into the models, which provides a great context for the presentation I'm going to give. And also like to say thank you to all my collaborators and co-authors here. This is very much, a team effort, and a lot of the work has been done by the people that are named on this slide. And I think a couple of them are also here at the workshop today. So a big thanks to the team. So I would like to start. I should be able to control the slides. Nothing seems to be happening. There we go. So I'd like to start by just presenting this kind of framework overview, which is the adaptive management approach that's been taken in the UK, which is where I'm most familiar with, in predicting and assessing the risk of, we're going ahead quickly, of collision risk on marine mammals. And effectively, there's obviously been very little information on this, and therefore this kind of adaptive management and monitoring approach has been absolutely crucial to allowing progress under uncertainty. And so the work that I'm going to describe today sort of fits within this framework of how risk has been predicted based on existing baseline data, and then how that's been modified, or how we're beginning to modify those assessments with the collection of empirical data through monitoring. And then also to highlight an important factor of this kind of framework is that we're prepared we should be prepared to mitigate should we find that through our deploy and monitor approach that risk is actually, when we refine it, is greater than we originally predicted, which is quite an important part of the framework. So kind of highlighting that a lot of work has been done to date on the baseline use of tidal sites by marine mammals, recognizing all these different parameters that Lisa covered that are very important predictors of collision risk, in terms of animal density being probably one of the biggest scalars of collision risk. As a lot of effort has gone into looking at characterizing and quantifying the use of tidal sites by marine mammals. And the examples on the slide here are where we've used seal telemetry to predict seal usage, quantitative usage of tidal sites before turbines have been installed. Also, a number of other techniques have been used to do that, including ship-based line transit survey using visual observers, but also towed acoustics to detect echolocating cetaceans and predict the density of animals at tidal sites using that technique. Just move on. And also, as Lisa pointed out, the depth distribution is also very important in terms of predicting risk and knowing which parts of the water column animals are using. And similarly, we've seen a lot of examples of seal telemetry being used to characterize the depth distribution of seals, as well as the use of novel techniques such as drifting hydrophone arrays and hydrophone buoys to determine the depth distribution of echolocating cetaceans such as porpoises. I do apologise, the slides seem to be on a kind of automatic advance and they're kind of going ahead of me. Keep trying to bring them back to where I am. And also the behaviour of individual animals in terms of their swim speed and their orientation is an important predictor of collision risk. And we've seen examples of where empirical studies have actually shown that the animals might be behaving in slightly counterintuitive ways, such as these examples here of seals swimming slowly against the current in areas of high tidal flow. And we've seen that both in Strangford Narrows prior to the installation of the CGen turbine, as well as in the Pentland Firth prior to the installation of the Maygen array. And some of the models that Lisa summarised can be quite sensitive to the assumptions that are made about swim speed and orientation. So it's quite important that we have that understanding of how animals are actually using those sites. So to go back a step there, we're getting a lot better at characterising how animals are using tidal sites before any turbines are installed, and those predictions of density, sort of those data on density and depth distribution and behaviour are then very important parameters for predictions of collision risk. But we know that's not the whole story. We know that there's the behavioural element in the presence of turbines, and how animals actually might be reacting to those is going to modify and alter collision risk. So that's where we've been, I think, making some better strides in more recent years to actually refine those estimates with the collection of empirical data. So we've been trying to get better estimates of near field encounter rate or density, and also try and measure avoidance and evasion in the field. So what do we know about responses to turbines? Going back to the CGen study, tagged seals showed moderate changes in transit frequency past the turbines, and transited at greater distances when the turbine was operating relative to when it was off. And modelling these telemetry usage surfaces with respect to the turbine demonstrated that usage was demonstrated a 68% reduction within 200 metres of the turbine relative to before the turbine was installed. That study actually showed that when we incorporated measured behaviour in the presence of the turbines, along with the empirical measurement of swim speed and swim direction, updated collision risk assessment actually resulted in a 90% reduction in predicted collision risk, just showing how important it is to collect that empirical data in the presence of the turbines. And there's some evidence that some of the observed avoidance could be related to the acoustic characteristics of the devices. Gordon Hastie's work at Cowray doing playbacks of CGen sound and that there was a significant decrease in the abundance of seals within 500 metres of the sound source during those studies. And then kind of more recently, the work we've been doing at Maygen on both seal telemetry and measuring passive acoustic detections and tracking of harbour porpoises. If I can get the slide to advance. There we go. So Joe's PhD work showed that track tagged seals, there was a significant reduction in seal abundance within 2 kilometres of the operating turbines, again relative to non-operation. And Laura Palmer's work also showed that porpoise presence within 150 metres of the turbine was reduced significantly during the operation of the turbine, and that the extent of that avoidance depended on the flow speeds, and it was actually stronger at the highest flow speeds that observed avoidance. And we've also been able to measure some very, very fine scale close range behaviour with harbour porpoises, and this is the first kind of substantial data set that we've collected of the 3D tracking of echolocating porpoises around an operational tidal turbine. And this is a paper that's just been accepted that with Doug Gillespie as the lead author. And this is shown from passive acoustic tracking that porpoises appear to be avoiding the swept rotor area. In a whole 12 months of monitoring, not a single porpoise track went through the rotor swept area while it was operating. But there's also evidence of porpoise aggregation and kind of clusters of detections around the base of the device. And that paper should be available soon if you're interested in reading the details. It's also important to try and understand if a strike occurs, what are the consequences. Liesl highlighted the model that tried to predict the population consequences, and also made the assumption that every strike was fatal, and we don't think that's necessarily the case. So work by Joe Onufru during his PhD, carrying out trials with trials with carcasses, demonstrated that severe skeletal damage indicating likely mortality was only predicted to occur in collision speeds above 5 meters per second. So that information can be used to scale our collision rates to try and predict kind of mortality rates, but obviously caveated, that's one study with carcasses for one species. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in this area to try and understand the consequences of collisions. So I think that's kind of a very quick whistle-stop tour of most of the kind of recent published evidence, or soon to be published evidence, I should say. So in terms of generalities, you know, how much can we draw from this? I think it's important to highlight that most of the work done to date has been on only 2 species. So it's only really harbour seal and harbour porpoise that we've really generated a sufficient amount of data to kind of make generalizations about how they might behave around tidal turbines. And I think it's also important to highlight that there's a very large number of species of potential concern globally that we don't know anything about. And I have to say I was quite jealous of, for those of you who are at the fish workshop, of Andy's long list of species that had been studied relative to our very short list of species that had been studied. Similarly, we have only really done detailed substantial studies of operational turbines at a very small number of locations. We've seen a substantial amount of baseline, of variation in baseline behaviour, so it's reasonable to expect that we might see site-specific variability in responses as well. So I think that's important to consider. Similarly, we've only carried out these detailed monitoring studies at, to date, on seabed mounted horizontal axis single turbines. And so it's important to recognise that there are a wide range of device types, surface mounted, more complicated kite designs, etc. And I think crucially arrays, as Lisa pointed out, predict how these predictions and data that we're collecting scale up to make predictions at array scale is another big gap, I think. So I'm just going to finish with a bit of detail on some work that is planned and ongoing to try and address some of these issues and just demonstrate how we're starting to use the data that's been collected to advance and refine our predictions. So in a collaboration between Nick Horn and Joe Onufru at SAMS and Nick at Queen's, involving SMRU as well. Oh, firstly, sorry, I'm skipping ahead of myself. First, I just want to go into Nick's work a little bit more detail and explain his approach for the simulation-based collision risk modelling that Lisa did cover. But I'm just going to go into it in a little bit more detail and try and explain what we're trying to do here. So Nick's simulation-based approach creates a tool that can adapt and grow to make best use of whatever data we have available and that we're continuing to collect. It's an approach that makes use of open source software to simulate the 3D environment. It's important to note that the nature of that software allows for quite a huge amount of user control over the system. You can alter the input parameters, such as the speed and the size of the animal and the angle of approach to any angle, any direction, etc. The 3D environment also allows for any device and animal shape to be simulated, including the complex 3D movement of tidal kites, the more traditional horizontal axis turbine, and also other complex shapes. Apologise, my control of this presentation is shocking. And I'm messing up Nick's lovely animation here. Sorry, Nick. There we go. So yeah, the more traditional turbine shapes and also other complex shapes. And thousands of simulations can be run and outputs can be very highly detailed, providing much more than a single collision rate or collision probability. but actually can give us individual probabilities over the whole of the swept area of the device, which allows post-processing, including the dive data, to refine collision probabilities by depth. And we can also extract the predicted collision speed between the device and the animal for each individual collision, which will allow us to incorporate that empirical data on mortality estimate to be incorporated to allow us to predict those the population consequences of collision. The results are very highly detailed across a variety of scenarios and range of parameters, such as the best and the worst case, which can allow exploration of uncertainty, which will allow for the best informed management decisions. And that's just a paper there for those who want to get hold of it and look more into this approach. So this is the collaboration that I started to talk about earlier between Joe and Nick and others at SMRU to use measured data on the distribution and behaviour of seals and porpoises close to the turbine and in relation to the current and the effects of the turbine to model the turbine operations and hydrodynamics on behaviour to allow the empirically predicted simulations to provide better informed estimates of the rate and severity of collisions at the array scale. And then just to finish with some other work that is happening very, very soon that we hope will give us more information to inform and refine our collision risk estimates and feed into the simulation-based approach, is the deployment of the Seabird platform at Maygen, the Maygen site, hopefully early next week, keeping absolutely everything crossed, that everything goes smoothly with the marine operations and that gets deployed. So this is a combined active, that's 2 multi-beam sonars indicated there, combination of active and passive acoustics that is intended to detect and measure and monitor behaviour, seal and porpoise behaviour close to the turbine. And the data are streamed ashore and processed and managed in using the software PAMGuard in real time. And ultimately, the data we hope to get from this are near field, fine scale 3D tracks of individual animals as they move in close proximity to the turbine. And this example shows harbour seal swimming around our dummy turbine and the track that's created by our automated detectors in real time. And this should allow us to determine behavioural metrics that can be used as inputs into collision risk modelling, such as the numbers of animals that move within a certain distance of the turbine, the numbers that move through the rotor disc, and the angles and the speeds of animals as they move through the turbine. So these data are incredibly useful to describe how animals behave around turbines. Looking into the future, we really need to be having that discussion to agree exactly how we use these data in a predictive sense, how we can use these data in particular to understand risk from novel designs, novel devices, and scaling up to array. So I'm really glad that this workshop discussion today is happening. I think there's a very interesting discussion to be had about how fine and medium scale movements and avoidance patterns, such as the kind of data presented today, how these either fit into the traditional sense of an avoidance rate parameter for refining those kinds of estimates, or whether the simulation-based approach using empirically measured behaviour and movements and applying that to a range of different scenarios is a better approach. And with that, I've probably gone horribly over time. So on behalf of me and the rest of the team, thanks for listening.
Okay, all righty. Well, let's go ahead then and report out. And I guess I get to go first once again. So we had a small group, but a really interesting group, a mix of researchers and regulators and advisors, which is helpful, I think, in this kind of context, and where we really focused our time and had a really good discussion around what's really needed. And the consensus was that understanding the really near field interaction and behavior of marine mammals around a device is the missing piece we have very little concrete information on. And we discussed what is the near field. Is it 5 rotor diameters, which is what we've generally used as a rule of thumb, and came to the consensus it's really, you have to think like the marine mammal, that what really matters is the distance at which the animal can detect the device. If it was an acoustic detection, it could be quite a ways away, but if it's it may rely for many marine mammals on a visual detection, which could be quite close to the turbine, particularly if the water were turbid. So we spent some time talking about that. We spent a lot of time talking about the use of tags, D-tags and others to really get at this fine scale behavior around turbines, and they're the ideal piece of gear. The caveat being, of course, you can tag all kinds of seals or dolphins or whatever, but the chance of them coming close enough to the turbine to get useful information, you have very little control over. So that may be a little tough. And that really we do need to concentrate on active and passive acoustics depending on the species. We had discussion around how much of the mechanisms of collision risk could be perhaps generalized. And we continue to worry that so much seems to be so site-specific, so species-specific. For example, the difference of looking at harbor seal information and extrapolating to gray seals, given how different their size, swimming capability, diet, and so on is, and therefore dive profile. It still appears with the marine mammals, we are going to have to get such a good handle on species by species and perhaps site by site. Certainly some of the information that's been gathered in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales to date indicate that different sites may be being used in different ways. So not a great coming together and solving the problem, but I think some really good thoughts put out there. My group, what did I miss that was a key point?
I think you covered it, Andrea.
Okay, thanks. Okay, group 2, Lisa and Jen. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I can start, Jen, if you want to add some thoughts after. So we had a good discussion on like several knowledge and data gaps, such as, and some that were brought forth by Carol already, but some lack of information on array and the cumulative effects also, and how the hydrodynamics or the presence of prey influence the behavior of the marine mammal, which would be a good thing to know. Having also some long-term data, because for now we only have data which are less than a year. So we don't know if actually at some point after a certain time, marine mammal can get used to the presence of a turbine. So it would be good to have some more long-term data. And having resolving all this data would mean that we could have some more general conclusion about how the marine mammal respond to turbine. It could be good also to combine marine mammal data with fish data to get a better picture of this interaction between prey and predator. It would be useful to better categorize the sites, such as difference between deep site, shallow site, etc. And we talk about some data transferability also. And at the end, that will allow to have a broader understanding of how marine mammals react, manage expectation. We had a good discussion on how do we manage expectation of the regulator. Like regulator would want to know like the exact amount of collision, but it's hard with what we have right now in the water, the monitoring system. It's kind of hard to know that. How do we talk to regulator? How do we manage this expectation of which kind of data we can have to have everyone on the same page? And we mentioned some baseline and monitoring technologies, such as having more fine scale near field data with telemetry, acoustic, and having pretty much a combination of a lot of methods would be more useful here together as the data. And one we mentioned was the ability to detect strike or the result of the strike, which right now is not possible. Jen, if you want to add anything.
I think you covered it, Lisa. That was pretty much everything.
Thanks.
Great. Ryan.
Okay, thanks. It's always difficult when you go towards the end because a lot of a lot of things are very similar. However, when we were talking about some of the knowledge gaps, one of the key things that we talked about was actually avoidance rates of some of the kind of larger scale things as opposed to the very near field behavior of particular animals. And the reason for that was because if we have a much better handle on avoidance rates, then we'll have a better understanding of how many animals are actually in the vicinity of the turbines and doing that small scale behavior in the first place. So understanding that potentially, I mean, if avoidance rates are very, very high, may even negate the risk of much further detail. However, that's not to say that some of the other bits of detail aren't important, particularly in a modeling context. So some of the other key gaps that we pointed to were things like, do collisions actually occur? And if so, how can we detect them? Evading capabilities of various species has already been mentioned. The other quite interesting point was understanding how to assess different types of devices, whether that be on the basis of the noise they emanate, the size they are, the places they're in the water, and at different scales. Now, the endpoint for much of this, should we be able to plug these gaps, is very much around refining the models and also carrying out more realistic impact assessments, which at the end of the day ease consenting and become less restrictive for the industry. Thinking about how to gather some of this data, I know that tagging has already been mentioned, and we talked a bit about tagging as well, but it was pointed out that actually, while seals are potentially relatively easy, I'm not experienced in this, so I have no firsthand knowledge, but maybe easier to tag. Other species are much more difficult to tag. For example, a harbour porpoise was one of the ones that we talked about. And given that we focus a lot of our discussion on avoidance rates, we talked a bit about how do you measure avoidance for species that you can't tag. And so there's a lot of work going on currently using passive acoustics, but I think that's potentially an area where of development, I suppose. Other things we talked about were better real-time monitoring of developments, and also sharing data across developments, and what can be learned from between one development to the other. We did mention, similarly to the other groups, that some species may not behave in the same way at different sites and different environmental locations. But almost from a quantitative point of view, would it be possible to understand which species have more variable behavior and which ones are more likely to behave in the same way? So with more data from different sites, we can begin to get a handle on that. And I think that's about it.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Lynette.
Yes, I like how the groups actually had quite different discussions. In our group, for the first Jamboard about the knowledge gaps, we discussed a little bit about the basic information that is still missing, about the swimming behaviors, different species that are in the area. But then we moved on to discussing a lot about how do you actually generalize between species, between sites, between devices, and how do you scale up to the array? So we are missing all the data to actually do that, the thought process to do this generalization or this scaling up. How to solve that gap? We did not find really a solution for solving that gap, other than we actually need to focus on the most species of concern for a pragmatic solution, but see what we can transfer from those species of concern to the others we don't know much, knowing that oftentimes the best case scenario for one species is not the best case scenario for another species. So how do you juggle between that? Same, what's the best case scenario for collision risk is not necessarily the best for disturbance or underwater noise, other things. We also discussed about the design envelope from developers and regulators, that sometimes they are too broad on, so there is not enough specific data collected for the species that we are interested in. Did not really find a solution for that either. There was a lot of questions being asked. And then on the way to collect data, there was a lot of discussion about how do we actually know that there is a close encounter or a collision. How do we get that last meter event? On that, videos are probably, we didn't discuss much about video, but sonars where there is way to see, but there is always that last bit of information that's missing on how could we have sonars designed in a way that we see that event. The fact that sonars are 2Ds and we are missing that 3D component. What else did we have? And then, yes, also a discussion about how do we get an equivalent for the bird carcasses that we have for on land wind. In underwater, we cannot really collect those remains from a collision. So how do we know that a collision happens? There was question about that. Lots of discussion around sonars. How do we get that piece of information, but not much solution yet. Did I miss anything from my group?
I think that's pretty good, Lenig. Yep.
Okay, thanks, Leneg. Michaela.
Yes, as Rhiannon mentioned, I think most of our topics have already been covered, so I'll try and be a little brief here as to not be too repetitive. But one thing we talked a lot about is what are the questions we're trying to answer for regulators, so that the data that we're collecting, the knowledge gaps we're looking at will inform those decisions. We talked a lot about solving this gap would lead to more certainty for regulators, more straightforward assessments and consenting processes, and maybe even less discussion needed for each application and for each development that goes in, which can certainly help the industry as a whole. Some things that were touched on before in other groups was the need for near field evasion, far field avoidance information, in addition to understanding kind of species residency patterns. So is there kind of this expertise of local groups of animals that may differ over time? Are there different kind of residency patterns that you see? Are they the same animals showing up in a location or a larger group that are coming across that area? One thing we also looked at or talked about was having appropriate mitigations, which are proportionate to the level of risk. And obviously that means we need to have a better understanding of what that risk level is, but that those are scalable based on our understanding. And then as far as kind of the data collection goes, we talked a lot about the need for sharing data and information to facilitate knowledge, especially the need to have comparable data and some maybe standardization of methods so that you can compare across data sets from different locations. So maybe some of that data transferability aspect I know other groups talked about in the last session on Tuesday, and then today it sounds like as well too. And considering the temporal resolution of surveys. So on that time scale, I've heard in other groups talk about the need to match the ecologically relevant scales rather than maybe our development scales or whatnot. And then, yeah, I think that was most of it that probably hasn't been covered or maybe has already, but I don't know if my group has anything else that I missed out on. Feel free to add that.
We are going to continue on with the Marine Mammals and Turbine workshop. Now we will have a brief presentation by Jen Fox with Aquaterra, who is going to sort of set the stage for how collision risk modeling has been used in practice for marine mammals around the MAGEN project. So Jen, please go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Can I just check before I start that you can see my mouse in the middle of the screen? Oh, good. Thanks, Lenig. Okay, so as Andrea said, I'm going to talk a little bit about collision risk modeling in practice in relation to marine mammals. So next slide, please. So I'm going to use the MAGEN project as an example, and it was great to hear from Carol a bit earlier on how much progress has been made and how much learning has been done since the MAGEN project was first consented. I think that's thanks in part to what has happened through the MAGEN project, but I'm going to just explain the actual consenting process and how collision risk modelling was done within the consenting of the initial phase of the MAGEN project. So apologies again, some of you will have seen this first slide. That was just the, if you were with us on Tuesday, this is just the general introduction to MAGEN. So you can see I can use my mouse. This is where the MAGEN project is in the north of Scotland, and it was first consented in 2014. And in 2018 was when phase 1A officially entered into operation. That's with 4 1 megawatt turbines. The phase 1 consent was for an 86 megawatt array, and ultimately the phase 2 consent will be sought separately for up to 312 megawatts. Next slide, please. So just some information on the baseline data collection that was done for the consenting of the MAGEN project. So there was 2 years of specific marine mammal surveys carried out by the developer. Those included vantage point, boat-based and passive acoustic surveys. And from those surveys, abundance and behavior, distribution and seasonality could be deduced for the marine mammal species of interest. I should have said in my introduction that a few people on the call were very directly involved in a lot of this work. So please, you all can correct me if I get any of the details wrong here. I'm just taking this from the information that's available in the public domain, but I'm sure many of you will know it very intimately, having been involved a few years ago. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of some of the results of that baseline marine mammal monitoring that was undertaken. So what you're looking at here is the phase 1 area for turbine development off the north coast of Scotland, and the zigzag line here is the transect for the boat-based surveys that were done. So what you're seeing in the blue circles is the pinniped observations, and the orange circles are the cetacean observations. Next slide, please. Okay, so getting into how the collision risk modelling was done for MAGEN then. So as we already heard from Lisel earlier on today, encounter rate modelling is what was used for MAGEN. So this was calculated between the turbines and marine mammals. And as Lisel already explained, and I'll just run back over quickly, collision risk is a function of the encounter rate. So encounter rate for a single predator is expressed as the product of the volume swept by the predator per unit time and the density of the prey. And in this case, we're considering the turbine as the predator and the animal as the prey. And so the encounter rate can be calculated using things like the turbine dimensions, the characteristics of the physical environment, and in relation to the marine mammal species, the species selection, the density, the depth distribution, and the swimming speed. Next slide, please. So in this case, 4 species were looked at in detail. These are harbour porpoise, minke whale, grey seal, and harbour seal. There was an assumption made that the encounter rate would increase linearly as the number of turbines increased throughout the installation period. And important to note, as Lisel has already noted earlier on, that the encounter rate doesn't predict the animal's interaction with the turbine. It's simply a prediction of whether or not the animal will encounter the turbine. So things like avoidance, evasion, collision causing injury, collision causing death, or collision causing no harm. This particular type of model doesn't go into that level of detail and doesn't consider those potentials there. And the encounter rate can be expressed either as the number of animals per turbine per year or expressed as a percentage of the population. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking at some of the results of that particular modelling that was done. So on the left-hand side, if you can see my mouse, I'll just point out some of the key things in the table here. You don't need to read every element of the table, but on the left-hand side, we're looking at two different species, harbour porpoise and minke whale. And then in the next row, you've got, or in the next column, I should say, you've got the avoidance rate. So this was done because there was an acknowledgement of a level of uncertainty around the avoidance rates for these species. The modelling was done for a range of avoidance rates from 50 up to 100. Across the top then, we've got two key columns. This was the density data for the project specific data, so that baseline, those baseline surveys that were done, and also other species density estimates that were available at that time. We're then looking at three different scenarios, 10 turbines, 20 turbines, and 86 turbines. And then just underneath that, we've got the results expressed in those two different ways. So the first one is the encounter rate, and the second one is the percentage of the regional population. You can see the grey box there for minke whale. That was as a result of the project-specific density data for minke whale being too low to be considered here. And also it's important to note that the avoidance rates was considered a really important part of this study, and at the time the literature was suggesting or putting forward that the avoidance rate would be at the upper end of that scale. And so in the consideration of the numbers that were put forward here for harbour porpoise, it was considered that there was less than 0.1% of the regional population would have an encounter with the turbine or turbines, and for minke whale it was less than 0.2% of the regional population. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about the seals next. So the common seal, or the harbour seal I should say, and the grey seal, which were considered here. And something that I'm sure many of you will be quite familiar with is the concept of potential biological removal. So this is where a number is put on the number of individuals that can be removed from a population before that population might be affected. And that removal is specifically the anthropogenic caused removal. So anthropogenic mortality more often than not, as individuals may be removed from a population. So the Scottish Government puts limits on the number of seals that can be removed from a population. And for seals in that management area in 2012, when this work was being done, it was 959 for grey seals and 18 for harbour seals. And so encounter rates that exceed that number were considered to be of particular importance, as it was being assumed that an encounter could cause a serious injury or death. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're looking at the same table here, but along the left-hand side, we've got the grey seal, both in feeding and travelling behaviour, and the harbour seal down at the bottom there. So what you can see here is the orange shaded cells in the table indicate where the PBR numbers could be breached. And again, the avoidance rate was a really important part of the impact assessment when it comes to this. So for grey seal, it was noted that a higher level of avoidance, around 90%, was assumed, and therefore it could be concluded that even though those orange cells are present for the 86 turbine array, those were in the lower levels of avoidance rate. And so it was concluded that the PBR would not be breached if we can assume that the 90% avoidance rate was accurate. For harbour seal, obviously we've got a much lower threshold in this area of Scotland for the PBR level. And so you've got quite a few orange highlighted cells, even with the 10 turbine array. But if you notice that that is going down to those lower avoidance rates, so 50 up to 80 for the avoidance rate. So it was noted that if the avoidance was to fall below 97% for the 86 turbine scenario, that the PBR could be breached. Next slide, please. And so ultimately in the environmental impact assessment for the project, the collision risk for common seal for the full 86 turbine array was the one element of this study that was deemed to be significant. And the key takeaway point, or the key acknowledgement within this study, was the importance of Scotland's survey, deploy and monitor policy at that time. So it was presented as a mitigation measure to employ the survey, deploy and monitor policy to be able to do monitoring and better understand the avoidance rates that were so key in this kind of modeling, to be able to understand what those what the risk might be. And the commitment was made that the learning would be able to inform the potential requirement for future mitigation. So ultimately in the EIA, it was this risk was concluded to be not significant, and obviously we all know that that project was consented. Marine Scotland recommended a consent for 6 turbines with a comprehensive monitoring programme, and so that was able to go ahead, and the monitoring programme was able to go ahead as well, along with the establishment of a monitoring advisory group and the provision of adequate funding to undertake that monitoring. And so as we've seen from Carol's presentation a bit earlier today, a lot of really fantastic work has been done around the Maygen site in the years since to learn a lot more and to really increase our knowledge and our understanding around these key elements, and avoidance rates being an important part of that. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
So I think we focused a bit more on the first 2 questions of discussion, lots to talk about. Our group talked a lot about the challenges with collision and encounter models, especially with assumptions that have to be made that can potentially lead to worst case scenarios, and the challenges that might bring up for social license and consenting. One thing I mentioned is people get very passionate about marine mammals, and having that number of how many marine mammals might be killed or potentially taken by an installation can be challenging for your social license at times. We also talked a bit about the difficulty to define cumulative risk between projects. So for instance, if there's multiple developers at a similar location, understanding the cumulative risk and kind of the number of, I guess in the US, we talk about like incidental take that you are allowed. That can be more difficult if you're in one site and staying below those thresholds in kind of a cumulative sense. And the requirement there for kind of this transnational agreement at times and working more cohesively to understand that. We also talked a lot about uncertainty that can compound with the different models, uncertainty in population parameters and avoidance rates and in model capabilities can mean that results are often only partially informative to regulators. Not to think that we focus on the cons the whole time. We talked a little bit about the pros as well. One thing saying that these are predictive models that are really useful for that application used at the consenting application stage, but that differs from monitoring the number of collision once built if consented. And that needs to be made clear to regulators and the public and other stakeholders about the usability of these tools. And the other pro is that the tools can be used together to look at the outputs. On the next question, we talked a lot about site or turbine specific characteristics that are necessary, especially because we had Jenny with Monesto in the group. And so I thought that was a really interesting idea to talk about here. We talked about the needs for their kite specific Monesto kite and how they actually had to come up with a different way to predict and model potential interactions. And so we talked a lot about how you can't quite standardize the models that's used, but that it might be more application specific, but that if we have thresholds that we can all kind of come to a similar understanding that would be more useful than maybe having a standard model, since that can't be applied in every situation. And then as far as field data and parameterizing validating model, the need for long-term studies as well as high resolution data on animal densities in 3D especially. And we barely got to the last question at the end, so I will let some other group tackle that one. And my group, let me know if I missed any other key points.
Great. Thank you, Michaela. Lene, do you want to go next?
Yes, I guess I will. So for the first question, the pros and cons of the models. So I think we mainly discussed on how few differences there is between the two models. There is not one better than the other. And that often, let me get that right, the difference in prediction that you get between the two modeling approaches will end up between smaller than the uncertainty you have with the input parameters. And so can use either one of the others, the differences will be very slight. We talked about, let me get back to the notes. I think that's the main point for that question. The next question, we had a lively discussion about the input parameters that we need. I think we kind of merged the last question, the population question, into this question as well. We didn't mention too much what we need from site or turbine specific. The obvious about turbine speed, things like that are usually relatively easy to get from developers if there is no private proprietary data made public. We talked a lot about what we need from the species side, seasonal and 24 hours data about how the species are using the area, the animal size, the swimming speed. We talked about having year-round data about the species, and that there is a lot of data for species of current concern, harbor porpoise and harbor seals mainly, but very little about the other species. We talked about having data about the turnover of a population, and density. There are so many stickies, it's hard to to pick some good ones. And so yes, about understanding the population effect. Is it are we looking at the local scale? We need to also look at a more broader regional scale to nest this project site population effect into a broader scale. And let's check the last one if I forgot anything. One point was that we have a better knowledge of population parameters for marine mammals than we have for fish, so it might be easier to model population effects of marine mammals than it is for fish that we discussed on Tuesday. And then there is a big political and public appeal for marine mammals that we need to keep into account. And my group, did I forget anything else? I guess that would be all. Rayanne?
Thank you, Lanaig. Rayanne, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
You're always in the middle.
Sorry? Oh, no, I'll go ahead.
You're always the middle one.
That's okay. I'm happy to be in the middle. So just thinking about some of the pros and cons of various models, or even a modeling approach in general, one of the first things that we discussed is that, and potentially a disadvantage of models, is that they can be difficult to understand, and it can be interpreted in different ways by different individuals. And so and that might be the result of miscommunications between those carrying out the modeling and those who will be reviewing the modeling approach, or those sorts of things. So because of their complexity, they can be challenging to understand. And that kind of links in a little bit with the rubbish in, rubbish out argument, that if it's not been made already, I'm sure will be. And we did discuss a little bit specific model types, looking at the encounter rate models versus strike type models or collision models. And it was noted that those models tend to give very, very similar outcomes for smaller animals, but for larger animals, they may give different outcomes. So it's worth understanding what those differences might be and why those differences would be arising. But again, as I mentioned after the last breakout, it remains that having a good estimates for avoidance rate is really the golden egg for these models. And from I suppose a more regulatory perspective, what they do is they can help us to explore that worst case scenario, so to really understand what that worst case could be. But it was noted that, again, another disadvantage of that is that in some cases there's been over reliance on high avoidance rates and potentially reverse engineering specific array proposals based on high avoidance rates as inputs to model outputs, and perhaps that's not the best way to do things. And again, models that are limited by data availability, but even so, they do give a range of predictions for which can be used in a precautionary type approach. Just in terms of data, there's all kinds of data. I think we had Nick Horn in our group, and he'd had a meeting about all the different types of data that could be inputted into his model, and it's vast. How long is a piece of string? But more importantly is what's actually reasonable to go out and collect, and what's computationally reasonable to include in the model. And we thought that approaches like the Hiccup platform are really appropriate, and particularly the combination of active and passive acoustics, enabling tracking of individuals around a device. A key sticking point for us was around density of animals and the scales of density estimates, and the difference between the density of animals at a larger scale, so averaged across quite a large area, versus the specific density around a turbine. And those two things were noted to be very, very different things. And that local density around a turbine or an array is very important, but was something that was quite expensive to get. And so that some developments may need to be the ones that take the hit, really, to establish whether or not data about particular species around turbines can be generalized across sites. So again, that's the kind of variability, site-specific nature of behavior of particular species. In terms of populations, we noted that all of the different models could be used for population assessment, but we questioned the accuracy, and again, that depends on the data that can go that goes into the model. But just as a note on a way they have been used previously, was around defining an unacceptable level of mortality and a level that those population level effects would need to fall below. And alternatively, where population level effects weren't predicted to fall below that threshold, using an adaptive management type approach to ensure that sort of worst case scenario was never reached. And finally, I mentioned it in Tuesday's session as well in our breakout group report back, but it's really key to define population. So what is the effective population that you're dealing with? And there's been some nice work previously about defining an effective population that might contribute to a particular location for an assessment. And I think that's everything, but I'm happy for my group to shout out if I've missed anything.
Thanks, Rayanne. Lisel and Jen.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having some difficulty here. Okay, so we just to highlight a bit some differences. We had a lot of cons, not a lot of pro. The pro was, yes, it's a great way to start to have an idea of what we could expect, and it's also like the worst case scenario approach. But there was like a lot of cons, as everyone mentioned, and I think the last model, such as the one from Nicholas Horn, who are including the spatial resolution, were actually a lot discussed, and everyone thought it was actually a good way to have a better understanding of what was going on. Some data, so when we discuss about some data, we mentioned some site data surrounding around the area, having more near field data where the animals are, and knowing like if they can encounter or know the turbine. So having more like spatial and temporal distribution data would be useful for model. And a lot of site and turbine characteristics were mentioned. For turbine, it was like the stage of development of the turbines, number of devices, location of device in the water column, swept area, tip speed, and yeah, I think there's like some main differences. And for the population, we actually talk a bit about that. Like everyone, we were running out of time, but and I think Ryan mentioned that, but you also need to define what is a population, difference between demographic population, evolutionary population, which actually could be a main difference between fish and marine mammals here. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Lisel. And last, group one, a lot of things have already been said. But when we talked about the pros and cons of the models, we did see some real value to these models because they're flexible, they can be adapted to almost any species, they're data-driven, and at least you get a first look at what things might be in a very conservative manner. That, of course, is part of the downside, is that the models do tend to come up with quite high collision risks, especially before applying realistic avoidance rates. So they're very conservative, which can make it very difficult to move forward with consenting. But we came to the conclusion that these models really are quite useful in the early stages before we know a great deal about the animal's behavior close into the turbine. So at least if we can know something about avoidance rates, run these models, we get that ballpark of consideration. But we did have a discussion around, okay, what happens after we use these models? We're monitoring the close-in encounter potential of the animals with the turbines. But this leads to where does this go? Does the industry have to monitor every turbine from here forward? That's simply not tenable. So how do we really get at these more detailed behaviors around the model, which we decided is the real crux of things? We agreed that it's pretty difficult to really properly model behavior of animals, especially because it changes, they learn, they're different populations, even of the same species in different locations, may act quite differently. We played with the idea a little bit of whether is it really relevant, whether it's a collision or an encounter, whether they're close in or they actually are hit by the turbine. And that depends a little bit on the status of the population. If it's a population already at risk, then focusing on those actual, collisions are really important, whether we'll be able to see them or not. But one of the things that really becomes a little bit of an advantage to the models if we use them properly is we can run them stochastically, so we can look at a lot of different possibilities, but and really define the uncertainty. But it's critical that we move that estimate of uncertainty forward rather than just a single point estimate. This many animals are likely to be struck. So really how you communicate and be certain you include the uncertainty is really very important. We got back to, isn't it really important that we think of how the animals perceive the turbine? At what point do they notice it? you recognize any kind of danger, whether it's an avoidance or a very close in evasion. And we talked about whether having to look turbine specific, how much can we transfer information of marine mammals around one turbine to another. The horizontal axis turbine is obviously very different than the kite. So, but maybe there are some sort of sets of turbine configurations we can use to think about these things. We then did talk a little bit about how these could be used for assessing population levels, and fairly good agreement that the PBR type models or other types of population models are pretty good if you had good inputs from the individual collision or strike models. However, these do not necessarily take into account the demographic data of the population. Are some loss of some individuals more important than others? We also, particularly in the US, have real animal welfare issues, as there are elsewhere, that there are some things around marine mammals that are very hard to very bloodlessly consider the risk. So those are the main sort of points we made. I think that we're a little different than others mentioned, but if my group has some other things to add, please jump in. Okay, well, with that, I would like to thank everybody very much for spending the time here today with us. And I'd particularly like to thank the organizers, the facilitators, and note takers, and a special thanks to Carol for and all her colleagues for putting together a really robust set of a presentation that really gave us a sense of where we are. So with that, we're going to conclude the workshop, and I thank everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and weekend. Goodbye.